Good afternoon to one and all present here. I welcome you all to today's session. Before we begin, we have a few instructions for the participants. Since we are using a virtual platform, you might experience a time lag. To avoid any disturbance, keep your microphone on mute and video off unless you are asked to speak. And in case you get logged out due to a technical issue, you can re-log in using the same link. And please use the chat box to post any comments, questions, or suggestions for our speakers. We will take up the questions towards the end of the session. And I would like to introduce myself. I am Aanchal and I work as a research associate at CSR Box. Today's session is called Education Masterclass 4 on using evaluation and assessments as a core strategy to achieve higher impact in education interventions by Grey Matters India, a leading educational assessment and analytics organization that is pushing the frontiers of K-12 education using a data-driven approach. The session will focus on question 0 and theory of change, and discuss case studies about strategic and tactical use of assessments from Grey Matter India's experience. We will discuss the key questions to address as an organization before drawing out the assessment strategy, designing reliable and valid measurement methods, integrating evaluation design to program design, and creating a continuous feedback loop for improvement. We will end the session with budget considerations in impact evaluations. We are honored to have two facilitators for this session. I would like to start by introducing Ms. Sowmya Velayudham, Chief Executive Officer, Grey Matters India. Grey Matters India has conducted impact assessments for 50+ educational interventions in India, advising funders such as Tata Trust, Michael and Susan L. Foundation, British Asian Trust, etc. on the effectiveness of their funding. Sowmya is passionate about measuring learning scientifically and believes that diagnosing learning gaps is the first step towards better education and efficient utilization of funds in education. Welcome, Sowmya. Next up, we have Mr. Prashanth Vasudevan, Vice President, Measurements and Analytics, Grey Matters India, who is a measurement expert at GMI and leads the data analytics team. His core expertise is in assessment design, IRT modeling, item analysis, scale development, and benchmarking methods. At Grey Matters, he has managed instrument development, data analysis, and overall planning of key projects such as the Saksham Ghoshna, Development Impact Bond, among others. Welcome, Prashanth. Thank you, both of you, to take out the time to facilitate this session today. And before we begin, I would like to remind you that the session ends at 5:10 p.m. And we will keep the last 10 minutes to take up the questions that have been posted by the participants in the chat box. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Aanchal. Thanks for the very kind introduction. I think Prashanth and me were also thinking we'd do it, but I think now that you've taken care of it, we're just going to jump right into the session. Hello, everyone, the participants. Very glad to have you here, and hopefully you can take something away from this conversation that is meaningful for your organization. And I know we have a very short time. We want to be very quick and efficient in about half an hour, where we will run you through some of the key ideas about impact assessment and how we do approach assessment in education. And Aanchal has already mentioned, we will address some of the questions that you're raising in the last 10 minutes. So we'll stop around 5 o'clock. What I suggest is, as the questions pop up in your head, please send them out on the chat box. Me and Prashanth will be evaluating it in parallel, and maybe pick about 3, 4 or as much time as we have to answer them towards the end. I hope that's clear, and please bear with all the background noise. It's part of the new normal. So with that, I'm gonna start with a presentation. One moment. Okay. I hope my screen is visible to all of you. Prashant, can you confirm that the screen is visible?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Okay, fine. All right. So without much further ado, just a quick introduction, which was already partly told. We represent Greaters India. We have together as a team, along with our larger organization, have assessed over 70 different organizations in India for their impact in education. We work across about 50 states, a little over 17 states now. And each year we conduct about 1 million assessments, this year touching around 1.7 million assessments that we conduct. We primarily work in the K-10 space, including early childhood and kind of all aspects covering education in that space, which includes cognitive, some non-cognitive, we're still experimenting with that. We do teacher assessments, we do teacher observations, and a bunch of studies with parents, school leaders, so the whole, and also of course the education stakeholders such as government players. So we do the whole team. So that's who we are, and like also as established, a lot of expertise doing this. We'll talk about it a little bit more. But more importantly, I want to know who's here to listen to us. So Anshul, if you can run the poll 1 for me for everyone to vote. I think it's going to appear on the chat box, correct? Yeah, if all of you can try to vote on this. Okay. I'm going to give it another 15 seconds to vote. Okay, all right, I'm going to stop. So it's an overwhelming majority from education. That's nice. And I would like to tell the others who are here that you will still gain a lot from this session as well. I hope you're seeing the results. Yeah, you're seeing the results. 77% of you are from education. There's some of you from skilling, a few from health, livelihoods, and some other sectors. Okay. All right, and one more question for you before I start. Can you also launch poll 2, Anshul? Yeah, can you all vote on this, which represents your work? Okay, giving it another 10 seconds and seeing 10 people left to vote. Okay, all right, I'm gonna end polling. Again, I see a lot of you from NGOs and a mix of other sectors, other categories of work. Great, I think so. We have mostly a high representation from education NGOs, which is great. And then we have some for-profit social enterprises, CSR funds, and others. Great. So I think that helps us to understand your expectations of the session. Ideally, in the normal situation, we would ask these questions before we started, but this is a great way to do it too. So yes. With that, I'll move into what I wanted to talk about. I have a few polls, more polls coming for you, but not as many as we go through the session. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about approaches to impact measurement, right? The most common approach that most of us are aware of is this one, where we get a requirement from the funder who's funding, or a donor who is funding that intervention, whatever education intervention that you are into, and they have a certain requirement in terms of performance, which is could be as number of sessions, number of beneficiaries, whatever it is they are provided by the funder, and you accordingly allocate time and resources as per their reporting requirements. Like some of them may have monthly, some of them may have like quarterly, and it varies. And also what are the different metrics they are expecting you to cover, those could also vary. And I'm sure you allocating resources as per those requirements. And then I'm sure most of you are also conducting these M&E activities in a very timely manner as required, and you submit these reports at the year end or at whatever requisite time periods are. And this is also, while this is primarily monitoring and evaluation, this is also a proxy for impact measurement. So this is how the most common approach or interventions is this. Can I, Anshu, the third poll, can I just get a show of hands in terms of, through the poll obviously, on how many of you follow this approach or a different approach? That would be helpful for us to launch into the second part of this approach impact measurement. Okay, I'm going to end polling in about 10 seconds. Most of your votes are in. Okay, all right, 50 votes. Okay, I'm gonna show you the results. So about almost 80% of you have said that this is the approach that your organization typically follows. And there are also reasonably 13% to 7 of you who are saying that currently do not have an M&E approach, which is fine. So that is an approach, and that's, like I said, the most widely followed approach. Now, before I'm going to stop sharing these results. And so how do we make this more strategic? Now, if you look at this approach one, it is a very parallel track to your intervention. It's a checkbox that you fill in as a part of an activity list. But when you think of impact assessment more strategically, it looks something like this one. Yeah, it looks more like this, where it's a cyclical process, right? You are taking, you're taking an approach to impact measurement that is more integrated with your intervention. You first define what you want to measure in a very, very strategic manner, and that in itself is a whole process, and we will touch upon it in detail in the following slides. A lot of times impact measurement falls apart because you're not defining what is the intended impact in a very well thought out manner. Of course, all of us have a sense of what you're trying to do as a task, but what is impact is a much more larger, broader question that requires an organization level think and brainstorming. Right? So the first is to define what is impact mean for your organization. Then the second piece is collecting information, verifying, validating data, and creating a data system. I'm sure this part is done mostly rigorously in many organizations. And then part C, where there is analysis, of course, I think partially still done in most organizations, but when the definition of impact is not well clearly defined, then analysis can also suffer because you don't know what you're looking for in that data. You collect the data, but you don't know what exactly you're looking for. And you look for insights. My earlier mentor used to say, you treat data like, you are a CBCID officer. You look for evidence in it, evidence of impact or lack of impact, and you need to wear the lens of disproving the hypothesis that there is impact, and look at the data and look at it critically. And then based on what you find, you must be willing to integrate it back to your program, right? Then you're able to improve your program in a manner that your impact keeps increasing in every cycle that you undertake. Right? And throughout this presentation, there are resources that are provided. Like I said, this is a very quick session, so I'm going to quickly run through some ideas and thoughts, but encourage you to go back and read about this in more detail, right? So for example, while we talk about the strategic approach, it always helps to think through an organization that has not, where it has not worked or where they've done it wrong, so that you can understand what we're talking about. So a couple of years back, maybe even 3-4 years back, we had assessed an organization whose model in education was to create satellite classes that beamed into rural areas in a state, right? So they were beaming spoken English classes. Now, impact for that organization would have technically been that the children improved their English skills. I hope all of you can see why that should be the case, and that what happens is you get caught into the idea of creating content. You can create great content, and in the idea of creating the technology, the great technology that beamed the classes from a central location in a city to all these rural areas. So they were very successful in doing both of these things. But that did not achieve the impact because the last mile problem remained unsolved, right? So these are examples to think about, because if you're constantly asking the question on top, which we call question zero, there is a seminal paper on this by Professor Leonard from Harvard Business School. Some of it is listed here. I request you to again read it. Or, I mean, if you Google it, there are some resources on this. The first question to ask is, what are we trying to accomplish? And not at a top level, right? To ask many layers of why. Why are we trying to accomplish this, right? So for example, if you take Grey Matters as an organization, it is, what are we trying to accomplish? We are trying to accomplish building a universal metric of measurement for students. But does that solve any purpose? No. Why are we trying to build it? Because we want to solve for equating the learning levels of many students on the same scale. Why are we doing that? Because we want conversation about education to change, and at a policy level, at an advocacy level, so that if you ask many layers of why, then you will understand what is the core crux of an organization. Again, for an organization, let's say, that's trying to do a teacher training, right? What are we trying to accomplish? If you answer that question with, we want to train 3,000 teachers, then that is not answering your question zero. What will answer your question zero is, why are you training 3,000 teachers, right? So that they can go and impart it to maybe 3,000 students. So why? So keep those layers going until you have an answer for what are you as an organization trying to accomplish. And this question zero is core to an organization. And then once you know what your question zero, you define the logic model. Again, lots and lots of resources available on the internet about the logic model. And like I said, this is an activity that I encourage every single organization to undertake with your entire team, to fill out these sections in the logic model. The logic model essentially gives you clarity on what belongs in the level of activities and outputs, and what really belongs in the realm of outcomes and impact. I will also warn you that as we think of this moment, just getting a laser pointer. So as we move away from outputs towards outcomes and impact, what happens is that we call that the data horizon, and the data ability to collect data actually goes down, because this is where you can really collect solid data. Your resources, your activities, a lot of comfort there. We know how much resources we are giving. We know how many sessions we are conducting. We know how many parents we met, how many teachers we trained. And there is a lot of comfort with these two, maybe to some extent with three. I will little bit quickly explain what belongs in each of these categories. But as we move to outcomes and impact, it gets tougher to measure. So it also means that you need to be more rigorous. At least outcomes needs to be measured, and creating rigorous ways of measuring it is important. Resources and inputs, very clear. What is the human resource requirement? What is the money requirement? Is there any equipment you need to give? Those are resources and inputs. Activities are the things that you would do, right? Like basically you would create content. You would create some sessions or a training module for someone, whether it could be a teacher or a school leader, or you could create community interaction sessions. So these are all activities that you will undertake. And as outputs, you would have conducted those sessions, those training sessions, those community interactions. Those are outputs, and you might have some feedback from those sessions. Those are all outputs. They all belong in the realm of outputs because they don't really tell how that has changed the practice of a parent or a teacher or a student, for that matter. That's then you get into the outcomes realm. Now, there are, if you want to test out your logic model, there is a list of questions here. Like, who are you seeking to influence? What benefits are you seeking to achieve? What are the results, that is? When will you achieve? Time period? How will you make this happen? And that's defined in the activities section. Where and under what circumstances will you work? What is the context? What are the challenges? And what are your assumptions in this model? So all of this will come together, and this becomes like a central document of any organization that's trying to achieve social impact. And this is not something that you create at a leadership level and keep it within the leadership level. It has to percolate to the last layer of ground staff in order for the logic model and the question zero to take life. And that will actually be much more meaningful for you to create impact, because every time you're doing something, you are doing it against the framework of your question zero, against the framework of your larger vision. Again, just giving a quick example before I hand it over to Prashanth is, see, in our organization, majority of our work is about creating good tests that can measure children's learning levels, right? Like we have subject matter experts. Now their job is to create questions. Now, if they start looking at it as I'm creating a question versus thinking I am creating a question such that the measurement can be done in a valid manner, that will lead to building an universal metric, which will eventually be a tool in changing the education system. When you have that level of thinking at the last level of staff, the quality, the design, and the work that you do as an organization just elevates itself. So I recommend thinking about impact measurement as much beyond a checkbox activity and taking it and elevating it to being a central purpose role around which you design impact measurement, right? I have given a set of examples here, which many of us measure, but these are necessarily not always measures of outcome. They are primarily measures of input or output. This is just for you to understand. And with that, I'll just move on to how we as Grey Matters have approached educational intervention. And for us, I think I'll just give the broad points and let Prashanth elaborate post that. So we believe that any educational intervention, whether you're doing it even in the non-cognitive space, right, or you're doing it with the school leaders, which is two degrees away from a student, let's say, we still expect learning outcome to happen. Learning outcome should change. The time taken might vary, the magnitude might vary, but the learning outcome must change. We believe in tracking growth, not so much the absolute, because India has more than 50-60% first generation learners, and we believe it's important to see whether children are growing in their learning outcomes, and benchmarking can only be a reference point. And with that, I'll hand it over to Prashanth to speak a little bit more in detail about this. Prashanth?
Yeah, thank you, Sowmya. Yes, the question zero, or what is normally called as picture of success, is the most important thing to have even before we start anything. That actually gives us a plan, implementation, and the feedback that is necessary for the whole program. As Sowmya was talking about, like there are various things that we usually do as a part of monitoring evaluation, like at a school level, we do talk about parents' feedback, teachers' quality. We measure about how the management is doing, and then we also do think of infrastructure, whether we have right resources, and if it is a bigger program, we do take care of program monitoring. Are meetings happening? Are the sessions happening in a regular way? So there's so much of information. It's not more information that is required to take the right decision. It's the right information which is needed. So as what is defined here as end game. So all the activities, all in education, all the activities, all the intervention that are planned are to achieve that the students learn. And the students learning is the key factor that we are proposing. So everything should lead to students learning. So technically it's called a student learning outcome. A learning outcome is simply what a student can what he can do in the sense that he can apply what he knows as concepts, or analyze something, create something out of it, evaluate a scenario, or various things that he would be able to do. That is what we are saying is learning outcome, just to give an example. So is there a way to measure this learning outcome, or is it all just a theory? If it is a weight or a height, then we just have the standard metrics and we just measure it. Is there a way to measure the outcome? Is something that we are going to see. We can move to the next slide. So usually when we say testing, we are used to our classical method of testing where we conduct a test. It has some questions. It has usually 50 questions. It's a summative test, and then we express results in the form of proportion correct or percentages, like a student got 35% or another student got 65% and so on. But there is a limitation in this method of testing. One, if the tests are different, the percentage cannot be compared, because one test could be easier, the other test could be difficult. And also there is also a potential difficulty of measuring learning outcome year on year. So wish if we had something like a height scale where we can measure it at any given point of time and measure it longitudinally. As it is shown here, a height scale, somebody can say that at grade 5, a student is 4 feet tall. At the end of the grade 5, he is 4 feet 3 inches. So, and maybe at the end of grade 6, it is 4 feet 6 inches. So there is a measurement possible, at least in a height or a weight. Is there something to measure the learning outcome of students other than expressing it in just the percentages? Yes, it is possible. There is something called as the scale, educational metric scale, which can be developed based on IRT, which is item response theory modeling. Well, I'm not getting to the technical details of how it is done and what are the different methodologies or models involved. But just to give an example, if most of you are familiar with GMAT scores, GRE scores, every participant or every test taker would get a different set of questions, but the test scores are comparable, right? So this is possible when a model takes into consideration of question and its difficulty and association with a particular scale. If all the questions can be measured on the same scale, then the scores will become comparable. So at Grey Matters, we have developed a vertically integrated scale by our testing data. Like we had more than 1 million students data, so that we could actually come up with a single integrated scale for measuring learning outcomes. So what does this enable us to do? One, as I was giving an example of height scale, height scale. So it enables us to monitor growth from time period to time period. Like it could be a year on year, or it could be baseline, midline, endline. So all of them could be measured. And it also enables us to define skill level. Skill level, for example, if we have the right benchmarks, we can categorize the students into, you know, as basic, intermediate, or advanced level of learners, so that the categorization would actually provide us a feedback to the program to work on which level. So, and then it would help us to compare two different groups of population, maybe in a particular program. Are girls doing better than boys? Is one set of district, if it is across the state, is one district doing better than the other district? So the comparison across population, age groups, or even cohorts is possible with this single scale. And then once we have the good set of data, we can also benchmark it at a higher level. For example, we do have national averages for a government school. We do have national averages for APS, affordable private school. Likewise, it can be city-wise average. It can be a CBSE average. So there can be benchmarks. And how this would help is when we start a program, a picture of success, it could be like wherever we are, probably we would march towards the national average and surpass it in 5 years. So what do we need to do? So this is something that helps us give a bigger picture, and this also enables us to measure it in time, in the successive periods of time, and see whether are we on target, are we on track, or are we hitting the milestones intermediately. So we do have this Pinnacle, and we are using it. We are using it in various use cases. Probably I would explain some of the use cases that we have. Let's say we are talking at students level. We do conduct tests at student level, and what this would mean is, compare students at how they are doing with respect to a cohort, with respect to what the student levels are at higher level, so let's say a national average, and so on. This would help us identify the area of improvements for the students and give feedback, which they can work out with their parents or the teachers and so on. So at teachers level, it would be a measurement of teachers both, grasp on the concepts, which is the which we call it as knowledge, and the classroom skills, which is how do they monitor, teaching learning methodology, as technically to put it. So once we identify this again, the scale compares, benchmarks the performance, and what are the best teachers doing, and then it actually gives them a feedback again as to where they should be, so that the remediation can happen for improving the class performance. This can be done at a school level. Typically, what happens at the school level is a combination of multiple grades would be assessed in multiple subjects, so as to get the overall student learning outcome index of the school. Along with it, optionally, other input-output parameters can also be measured, and then which helps to root cause where the problem is, why the student learning outcome is so, and probably it would pave way for the next steps to be taken by the school or the system to increase learning levels or the quality, which actually gives way to increase in business or impact potential. So at a higher level, there are funders or investors using it. They do fund various interventions. One of the intervention can be like a good school leader program, wherein a school leader would bring about a change in the school. Another could be a teacher training. The other could be remediation methods. So there are different interventions. A funder would actually research on what possible interventions for a particular set of schools or a set of region. This Pinnacle helps them to compare the performance of different intervention, and then choose the right intervention and scale it up and achieve higher student learning outcomes at a scale. So yeah, these are the scales, but this is just not theory, and we have been doing this in our use cases. I would want to quote some of them. I know we are running late. I would just quote some of them and give it back to Sowmya. One of them is Saksham Haryana program, most of you would be aware of, where their goal was to have 80% of the students at grade level. So we were the evaluation partners, and the typical the model was to measure whether the student is at grade level or not. So we could use the scale to conduct multiple rounds of testing and then measure whether the block is actually at the grade level achievement or not, and then to award block grade level status or not. So we use the pinnacle there. And there is another program called Development Impact Bonds, which is outcomes-based funding, where they are supporting different interventions. This is a case of investors and funders, supporting different interventions. They are supporting different interventions, where one of them is a EdTech program, the other one is a school leader program, the other one is a remediation program, the other one is a full school model. So they're funding all these, and then there are different target sets for each of these service providers. We are the evaluation partner there, and then we do assess them whether we are setting their targets, whether the service providers are meeting the targets or not, and they will be funded based on their the outcomes they have achieved. So likewise, there are quite a few use cases that we have been doing associated with various organizations. I mean, probably next slide would give you a kind of a bigger picture of who are the different organizations that we are working with. You can move on, and so probably each one of them is looking for a different picture of success, and Pinnacle is helping them to achieve that success, is what I would say. Handing over to you, Sowmya, we can quickly talk on budgeting and then probably take some questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Prashanth. Thanks for that detailed session. And like I already mentioned, this is a short session, so we have only a few minutes. Anshul, can you launch poll 4 while I kind of set it up? So, so we have only, like I said, touched upon a few things, and there's a lot of reading you can do, and also we will provide some details that you can reach out to us with if you have questions. In the meanwhile, if you can just start answering this poll that is showing up in front of you, which asks for the constraint and impact assessment that you have. All right, I'll give it another maybe 10 seconds. Bit more, I think only 60% have voted so far. I'll get it to 70%. Stop the polling. Okay. All right, I'm going to end the poll. And so I think budget is one, and lack of expertise is another thing that's coming up as the key constraints. Lack of it is not really top of mind for many organizations. I hope you're seeing this. Okay, yeah, this is the poll results. Sorry, I thought I had shared it. So that's how it's looking. And yeah, so we'll touch a little bit because we do hear a lot. I mean, we are being asked to engage with clients on impact assessment. Budget becomes a constraint, and also like their understanding of impact assessment, which is actually linked to budget, because you view the impact assessment as a standalone activity, as something that, I mean, a lot of times we get asked, you're just putting a bunch of questions together right? And it is and nothing bad about it. We are in the business of educating people on why it's very important to think carefully through, first of all, what is it that you want to measure, then design for what you want, and accordingly analyze and therefore give insights that will actually lead to program feedback, right? So like I said, the integrated strategic process is what we aim for. And like I was mentioning, budget is something that keeps coming up as a thing, and lack of expertise. It was interesting for me to learn that lack of internal expertise is seen as a limitation. But our quick note on that is that impact assessment, it should be part of your budget when you're creating a grant or proposal. Like I said, it's integral to the thinking. We are running a program. We are going to spend crores of rupees. So the question is to, at the beginning, ask, how are we going to know if it is successful or not? And are we okay with looking at it from a real lens and taking the real feedback? Because this is about the lives of children, right? So right when you write the grant proposal, your impact assessment strategy needs to be in it, and it has to be budgeted. A typical budget range for impact assessment is 7 to 12%. That's when we can do a reasonably good impact assessment. A lot of times there is this knee-jerk reaction. Wow, so if you're giving me 1 crore, you're asking me to spend 10 lakhs on impact assessment. Isn't that kind of, should I not be spending everything on the future of the children? I would like to take a step back and say that, see, impact assessment can actually drive up the value of those 90 lakhs that you're spending to significantly higher amount, rather than you kind of holding back that 10% in the beginning. So see it as a future investment. And all the organizations that we showed you, which are actually in the forefront of educational intervention, allocate that much of their budgets, overall funds, for impact assessment, and that is the best practice. And also there is a general thinking that, it is required to do a census. Sometimes the funder requires it, but you can do more meaningful impact assessment by using sampling creatively, innovatively, and meaningfully to check and evaluate and analyze the impact of your projects, with that in mind as well. So I think that's a wrap for us. Just a quick summary. First of all, define what is it that your impact that your organization is creating. Ask your question 0 and create a theory of change model. And that should be a bit and understood and shared by every single person in the organization. Use a rigorous metric like what we are using, a pinnacle or a very well-designed metric to measure outcomes, so that it can be meaningful for the organization and for the larger public as well, right? When you can prove that your model works, then there is merit to scaling it as well. And then the last is, keep that budgeting and sampling can help you manage the process better. With that, we'll open for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see what questions have come up. I'm seeing, I wasn't able to see the chats while my screen was sharing.
Do you want me to share the question?
Sowmya,
Yes,
you can look at. Okay, so there is a question: is there any assessment which will try to assess the level of knowledge given by the student? In all our programs, we do a baseline endline. Usually, the baseline would actually look at where the student is at the beginning of the year, and the end difference in gain of baseline to endline, which we can do using a vertically integrated scale like Pinnacle, gives us how much they have gained in 1 year, and it is something that we are doing very commonly across all programs.
and I'm seeing a question by Ayon Day, which is about best practice for benchmarking if you're trying to assess something abstract like behavior change. And this is probably one of the biggest questions that remains unanswered in the measurement space, because non-cognitive or behavioral change is one, it cannot be standardized like learning outcomes. I think that's the biggest struggle we have. And I think there have been many failures when we brought in models from outside the country into India. So there has to be something that is homegrown. Many of us are trying to develop something which can track behavioral change, but I think no one has cracked it yet. But I think in the next 3 to 5 years, you should have a test that allows you to do that. But I will always suggest to use something like that with caution, because behavior is much more abstract, like you yourself mentioned, and it's hard to bucket. So I mean, and usually it is custom developed. If you're looking at behavior change, like say parental behavior change, before a program and after a program, then those are better built in a custom basis. For student and comparison purposes, many people are working on it, but right now there isn't anything that is widely available and universally used at this point.
There's a question on critical thinking. So are there any indicators developed for this? Yes. Usually in a language or a math test, it is straightforward because it is all well known. Critical thinking is something that we have done it specifically, and we do run a program called All India Critical Thinking Test, which is a national wide scholarship program, competition for students. We have actually got into what are the different aspects of the critical thinking, and then we have come up with an indicators to know what is the critical thinking capability of a student. Maybe we can take this offline and I can explain more, but yes, it is possible. Yes.
And I'm going to answer just one last question by, I think if there is anything else, we can take it up separately. There's a question from Rangarajan A on national level benchmarks. Which data are you relying on? So since we are using, like I said, we have data of millions of students. We've been assessing students for 6 years. So we have our own database using which we calculate the national average, because these are scale scores. NAS has a different scale and ours is a different scale, and so do other assessment players. So they're not necessarily comparable immediately. So currently the benchmarks that we are using, so because we've assessed several million students from say a given state, we have a benchmark for the state, or we have several million students data or several thousand students data from APS schools. We have a benchmark from across, I mean, from a representative population from about 25-30 cities. So we are able to say that is representative of that population, and we are using those benchmarks. That's the answer to that question. I know Anshul is looking at me, and there is, I think, 1 more minute left in the session. I'll just say that we are happy to answer further questions. Like I said, this is a very broad topic to cover in about 40 minutes. The idea was to just get you to start thinking and ask questions. You can write to us at impact@greymatters.in, and I'll put that in the chat window here as well. So if anyone, Prashanth, can you just type it out on the chat window while I speak? If anyone has further questions, please feel free to write on that email, and one of us, me or Prashanth, will respond to questions or get in touch with you.
Thank you so much, Sowmya and Prashanth, for the session. I think it was a very engaging session, and you did complete justice to the topic. And one quote which will stay with me forever, I think, is that the most common form of human stupidity is that we forget what we're trying to achieve. So I think that summarizes the session also, and the relevance of asking the right questions for the organization. And again, thank you so much for taking out the time.